Morning. Thanks for coming along. Really grateful. This is obviously our pre-budget speech to prepare the ground for some of the demands that we're going to make in the budget next week. Next week, the Chancellor will stand up in Parliament to deliver his first and last spring budget. He'll no doubt want to paint a rosy picture of progress since the autumn statement just a few months ago. But if progress has been so significant and all is going so well, why is the government continuing to pursue spending cuts? From the NHS to social care, from prisons to education, our public services, as you know, are in crisis. And Brexit will present challenges to this whole country as well. And Labour is prepared to meet all of those challenges. Yet instead of rising to the challenge, I fear the approach from this government on the economy is to continue the failures of the past. Look behind the headline figures and the real story is apparent to all of us. The essential facts on our economy remain as follows. Low investment over many decades has led to a low productivity, low wage economy. Insecure and poorly paid work dominates new job creation. That in turn means that the tax base needed to secure our public services is now less stable. Deliberate decisions by this government to privilege tax giveaways to the super rich and giant corporations have further undermined the tax base. This model is not sustainable, and the failure at national level is absolutely palpable. The Conservatives will soon have added £750 billion to the national debt since they arrived in office. At the same time, they will have imposed the first spending cuts on schools for 40 years. And NHS, as you know, is in a state in profound crisis. Let me pay tribute to those who work in our public services and manage our public services. They've done their best under the austerity onslaught. And coming from a local government background, I tell you, local authorities in particular have had to cope with the most extraordinary sharp funding cuts in recent history. They will not sustain a further round of spending cuts. So when the Treasury casually announces this week that it's looking for a further 6% of funding cuts to some government departments, it's an act, in my view, of gross irresponsibility. And the comments today you will have listened to on the radio from the head of the Care Quality Commission at the NHS, and I quote, stands on a burning platform, I think have driven home to all of us the scale of the crisis. Cuts to social care amounting to £4.5 billion since 2010 have brought the system to the brink of collapse. Over 1 million vulnerable elderly people now, including many who are very frail, now lack access to the care they need. This is one of the richest countries in the world, and yet Tory austerity has brought our public services to the brink. Social care now has a £1.9 billion deficit for this funding year, and this needs to be filled immediately to stabilise the system. And based on estimates by the Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountancy, the NHS and social care together face a funding gap of between £8.5 billion and £15 billion by 2020. Published figures indicate that tax receipts actually are currently higher than previously anticipated. So let me say this. Given the immediate crisis we're facing in the NHS and social care, I'm calling upon the Chancellor to use that money to address this NHS and social care emergency we're facing now. Any measure less than this is likely to be inadequate. But it's not just those who rely on our public services who have suffered under this government. The slump in living standards overseen by this Tory government is the worst this country has experienced since the Industrial Revolution. The Chancellor may try and boast about rising GDP, but that hasn't turned into real improvements in people's lives. The reality of our economy is that the average real hourly pay remains over 10% below its level before the crash, and that cuts to public services have now placed them, as the Independent Institute for Government has said yesterday, close to outright collapse. The record on living standards is the worst of any leading economy. Only Greece has seen a bigger fall in real pay. And Britain has the distinction of being the only large developed economy in which wages fell even as the economic growth returned after the crash. And now rising inflation as the government mishandles Brexit is devaluing people's wages even further. Yet the government has reneged on its promised national living wage level and is continuing to pursue cuts in in-work benefits, which will bite from April onwards. Analysis out this morning by the Institute for Fiscal Studies shows that low-income working families with children will suffer the most. And they predict that the average household will be £5,000 worse off by the end of this Parliament than they might have expected. If the economy is growing, the benefits must be shared fairly. The Chancellor must reverse the £70 billion giveaway to the super-rich and giant corporations between now and 2021. And the cruel £3.7 billion cut to personal independence payments for disabled people must be halted. Let me just come back to public services. On public services, from education to local councils to prison services and social care, they're all in deepening crisis. And the burden is falling disproportionately on whom? On women. It is women who are bearing the brunt of low pay, cuts to in-work benefits, and the public sector pay cap. Put together, this government has created a toxic mix. Independent estimates by the Women's Budget Group suggest that 86% of the cuts now in public spending since 2010 have fallen on women. The Chancellor must take action in the budget next week to fund our public services and end this form of discrimination. In place of austerity, Labour wants a budget that works for women, that invests for jobs for women, funds the services that women depend on, and advances women's equality and economic independence. But let's return to the NHS and social care. It's the NHS, the National Health Service, and our social care services that tell us the most about this government's failures. It's essential that the government uses this budget to give the NHS and social care the funding they urgently need. The present Conservative government has been condemned for its fast and loose approach to NHS spending. The Chief Executive of NHS England has dismissed government claims that current funding is adequate, let alone more than they asked for. The Public Accounts Committee has rebuked the government for raiding the NHS capital budget to meet NHS spending needs. The Health Select Committee has dismissed the government's claim on increased funding. So the reality is that the government has consistently failed to provide the funding that the NHS needs, and it will continue to need in the future. Yet the rhetoric from the Prime Minister downwards has suggested anything but. There's an air of unreality about her claims that more and more patients are being seen by more and more doctors. You know the experience on the ground of patients, doctors and nurses is of a treasured institution already drifting into its greatest crisis in its history. The reality is that the Tories are imposing a real terms cut per head in healthcare spending. Current plans from the government do not come anywhere near close to addressing the scale of the crisis. So it's essential that they now bring forward plans to close the funding gap if we do not want to lose our NHS. Labour will never break from the fundamental principle that our National Health Service should be free at the point of use. And when we come into power, we will reverse Tory privatisation by renationalising the NHS. But it will require bolder steps to secure NHS funding where demand pressures are rising, confidence in government is low, but retaining NHS's historic mission of healthcare free at the point of delivery is a national priority. Public trust and confidence must be restored, not only in the government of the day, but in governments for the rest of this century and beyond. So recent discussions around the long-term funding future of the NHS have helped clarify some important issues. So I want to lay out the framework on how Labour will be looking to develop its thinking in the future. Yes, we want the immediate injection of resources in this budget into the NHS. But the financing of the NHS has become excessively politicised to the point where even supposedly official figures are subject to dispute. So there needs to be an independent adjudication of both needs and actual provision to restore public trust and confidence. The Office of Budget Responsibility has already taken steps to assess the levels of funding needed for the NHS in the longer term. And I've written to the Robert Choate to ask about the ability of the OBR to continue to provide these assessments as part of its overall brief to monitor the government's fiscal position. To change the OBR's responsibility and bring in permanent oversight on healthcare funding would require primary legislation from the government. Fair and objective assessments of long-term need are required along with close monitoring of actual spend being made. That's a bigger task than ministers can provide. So we need a political neutral body modelled on the Office for Budget Responsibility that can remove the question of long-term funding from the political squabbling. Only in this way can the public have confidence in the figures and confidence be restored. And yes, essential spending correctly be made. So secondly, we have to place funding for the NHS on a long-term basis. As Lord Macpherson and others have suggested, placing the NHS on a stable 5-year financing basis needs that certainty of funding can be assured. But we need to do more in funding, and tying it down for the length of a parliament is a step forward. But we view the fact that it needs longer-term stability. So that means the production of 10-year budgets rather than 5-year budgets. Again, objectively assessed by the OBR. The pressures that we know of today will continue to build up over decades. We need NHS budgets that can assure funding on those timescales. Third, we must show those expected to pay for the NHS that their tax money is well spent. The simple truth is that after the financial crisis and years of failed austerity, governments are simply not trusted. Creative accountancy and stealth taxes have helped chew away public trust in the system. And the fact that the wealthy can seemingly dodge their taxes at will has further undermined public confidence in the tax system. And politicians, to be frank, thinking only about the electoral cycle, have too many incentives to game the system. So people need to know that their contribution that they make will be spent properly. So hypothecation, allowing taxes raised to specific purposes, can absolutely make clear where that tax money is being spent. It can help restore the trust and confidence in taxation and government spending that has otherwise started to break down. But hypothecation for the NHS has to be more than a commitment from a politician or a political party to spend a given amount, however firm that promise. It needs a clear commitment over the longer term that specific taxes will be used for specific purposes and this spending will be properly monitored. That's the system we are urging to be put in place. Let's go on in terms of the government's rhetoric. The government's rhetoric on the economy has changed profoundly over the last year. They're catching up with some of the positions we've staked out. The Chancellor claims he now accepts the need for government to invest rather than to slash investment. He just won't deliver on it, though, will he? And the Prime Minister has offered fine words about, and I quote, good that government can do. And yet her government has actively pursued any excess spending cuts that have contributed to 30,000 excess deaths a year. They're not my figures. Those are the figures of the Royal Society of Medicine. And the disconnect between what ministers say and what they do has reached dramatic proportions. And the reason for that disconnect is clear. The Tory party knows that after years of austerity and sliding living standards, the sentiment against political elites out there in this country is palpable. That mood was a critical factor in the vote to leave the European Union last year. This government has sensed the mood and adapted to circumstances. They've borrowed the rhetoric of protest and now pose as the champions of the workers. Only 5 months ago, the Prime Minister and their Chancellor were given the impression that austerity was coming to an end. But much of the austerity, as you know, is yet to come. In the end, the Tory leadership are the elite. So they can make all the grand promises they wish, but they can't deliver the transformation our economy now needs. They don't have the political will to do it. Labour's already begun to lay out its alternative. We want to break with the past, not a continuation of its mistakes. So the fundamental task of any reforming government in the future will be to rebuild and reconstruct our economy. Our fiscal credibility rule and commitment to invest means that the next Labour government will break with the failures of the past. We will bring down the deficit while committing real government resources to increase investment. By the end of the next Labour government, the national debt relative to trend GDP will be lower than what we will inherit. We'll reverse years of underinvestment across the whole country, not just in the few existing centres for growth and prosperity, but delivering the funding that's needed so that our smaller towns and communities can share in that prosperity. The great divide between London and the rest has to be overcome as well, and we'll introduce legislation to correct the bias in investment funding for the regions. We'll commit the funding needed for specific infrastructure investments, like the 10 billion for Crossrail for the North and the new tidal lagoons that were being planned. Labour is committed to delivering 1 million new homes and building a new generation, yes, of council housing. And we need a government prepared to give back control to our localities. So alongside the National Investment Bank, the next Labour government will create a network of regional development banks that will supply the funding needed on the ground for local businesses to flourish. We can allow workers and those wishing to set up and run their own businesses the opportunity to take control back away from the boardrooms where short-term decision-making is dominated. And yes, the railways will be renationalised by Labour. But we'll also introduce a right to own for workers, giving them the first refusal on taking control of companies undergoing a change of ownership. And we use the regional development banks to support a new generation of cooperative businesses, at least doubling the size of the cooperative sector. Small and new businesses will be properly supported with reforms to the business rates, financing from the regional development banks and support for business hubs in every major town and city, allowing new businesses to work together and collaborate. We'll support investment by manufacturing firms by removing plant and machinery from business rates. And we'll reform corporate governance laws to block raiders trashing profitable companies and bankrupting pension funds. We'll want our large corporations to work for the public good, not against it. So we'll also introduce a fair pay ratio to stop top bosses paying themselves excessively. But to reverse the slide in living standards, we'll need to do more. Labour's real living wage will be £10 an hour minimum, meaning work will always pay properly, and the public sector pay cap will be lifted. We'll also restore trade union rights and repeal the Trade Union Act. And we've fought to defend the rights of EU migrants here, who contribute so much to our public services and our economy. As you know, the Lords passed the Labour's amendment, and we urge the government now to immediately bring forward a guarantee to protect the rights of EU nationals resident here. And we're working now with our European colleagues to protect the rights of EU citizens here, but also UK citizens in the EU. And of course, we'll halt the austerity cuts to in-work benefits and payments to people with disabilities. We'll need a clear plan for government to intervene on a major scale, supporting essential industries, fostering new sectors, and above all, creating decent, secure jobs across the whole country. And we'll use the power of government procurement, backed up by the National Investment Bank, to deliver a massive expansion of industries like renewables, where the global potential is enormous and our natural resources so significant. The next Labour government will break the cartel of the big six energy companies by creating the conditions for local, decentralised, low-carbon energy by supporting local authorities and cooperatives on these initiatives. We'll follow the German model. We'll target 3% of GDP on scientific research from all sources to deliver on the huge potential of our scientific research base. And from being a laggard in research spending, we'll move to being a leader. We can't run first-rate public services on a second- or third-rate economy. But we can't pay for the first-rate public services unless the tax system works fairly and effectively. There'll be no place to hide for tax avoiders and evaders under Labour. Our tax transparency and enforcement programme will clamp down on the worst avoiders. And building on the successful Nordic model, we'll introduce legislation to make the public the tax returns of those earning £1 million a year. Transparency and fairness is at the heart of building a decent and open society. We believe this will help restore public trust in the tax system and help clamp down on any avoidance. This programme of structural reform shall all be taken as fundamental. This is an outline so far, the economic programme of the next Labour government. It represents nothing less than the transformation of this country. We don't have to settle for the steady management of decline under the Tories. And we don't have to accept the failings of an elite that have led us into a decade of falling living standards, insecurity, and failing public services. There's enormous potential here in every part of this country, and we can build a radically fairer, a radically more democratic and more prosperous society. We can together turn this country round. That's our mission. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. Thanks for coming this morning. We're going to take about half a dozen questions. Usually we have about 3 from the media and then 3 from the audience. Okay. All right. Can I start with Ben Glaze from the Mirror?
Thanks. Ben Glaze from the Mirror. Thanks, John. Last week, you were warning that there was a soft coup underway against Jeremy Corbyn. Why did you feel that, and what made you change your mind?
I was annoyed at, to be frank, I've said this publicly a number of times, I was annoyed at the intervention by Tony Blair. I didn't think it was helpful for a by-election. Then Peter Mandelson subsequently informed us that every day he was engaged in some activity to undermine Jeremy as well. By the time we got to Sunday morning, I went on PNAR. I said, I think all of us really have looked over the cliff of Copeland and said we don't want to go there. None of us. I don't think anyone does, anyone on any wing of the party. So we've got to learn the lessons that we need to unite as a party. And on Sunday, I said what I'll be doing is just opening my door and also visiting people on all the wings of the party, just to talk about how we do that. Because actually on virtually every policy issue, I can't see that there's much difference. And when we had the leadership election last year and Owen Smith challenged Jeremy, the most common expression Owen used was, I agree with Jeremy. And the most common expression that Jeremy used, I agree with that policy. So there seems to be a coming together on those policies issues. So if there are other issues about how we go forward, let's discuss those now. But the most important thing is to unite. And I tell you why, it isn't just about the interests of our party, it's about the interests of our country. We need a strong opposition and we need to prepare for government. That's what we were doing last year. After the first 6 or 8 months of Jeremy, we were either just behind or just level or just ahead in the polls. And then the coup occurred and the leadership elections naturally show differences within the party, and that demonstrates, if you like, to some people in the electorate that the party is divided. I don't think it is. After Brexit, we then had the issue of Article 50, and our party was divided on the issue. We have to be straightforward about that. But Jeremy, I think, took a determined and, to be frank, courageous decision that we need a 3-line whip. That was supported by the majority of the Parliamentary Labour Party, and we held to that. And to be frank, if we hadn't done that, I think it would have undermined significant support for us in the country itself. What's the irony here, I think this is the deep irony that we're seeing already, is that we might have looked divided over the vote on Article 50 and the 3-line whip issue, but on every amendment up to Article 50, we were united. And the irony is this, is that we now have a united agenda on the Labour Party about how we go forward in these negotiations. For example, on this issue of protecting EU citizens and UK citizens as well. And it's the Tory party now that, having papered over the cracks, are now ripping themselves apart. And I think the most significant intervention in the debate on Article 50 was George Osborne's, when he said, the fight is yet to come after Article 50, and he wants to be amongst that fight. Well, he already is. So is John Major. So is Michael Heseltine. I think what you'll find is a united Labour Party on a common agenda, trying to get the best deal for Brexit for the country overall, the Tories ripping themselves apart. I cannot see Theresa May delivering some form of a deal that will satisfy Bill Cash, George Osborne and Anna Soubry. So I think now is the time for us to unite. We all need to learn lessons, and that includes me. I know I've got a pugnacious approach. I need to learn a few lessons. We need to unite now and listen to one another. Make sure that we work together to secure the best we can for the country on Brexit, and then lead into the next general election. We've got important elections coming up. We'll be fighting those as a united party. And that is holding out hands to, from my wing of the party to, from momentum we established, holding out hands to those people in progress. And yes, Peter Mandelson. And having a constructive relationship for the future. You heard it here first. Okay. I've got Ian Watson first, and then I'll come to you, Michael.
Ian Watson from BBC. First of all, on the substance of your speech, yesterday the Shadow Health Secretary, Jonathan Ashworth, said that Labour would have to find the money for the NHS and social care, but he personally didn't know where it was coming from. You would set out detailed plans. So if you give us more detail about the cash injection, that would be helpful. But also, did I pick you up right in you seem to be suggesting hypothecated NHS and social care tax, if you could be more explicit. Secondly, on Labour, the former Jeremy Corbyn supporter, Owen Jones, not Owen Smith, but Owen Jones, suggested a deal that Jeremy Corbyn should stand down in favour of a younger left-wing candidate going on to a leadership ballot. Is that a deal which you would find attractive, or is it evidence that there really is a soft coup after all?
Okay. On the first issue, Ian, what we're saying today is that this budget next week has to address the emergency within the NHS and social care. The government is basically arguing that the economy is growing, they've had increased tax receipts. We're saying that money needs to go to the NHS and social care now. There's a real emergency there. I did a film last week in my constituency with a constituent, young woman looking after her father who's had 7 strokes, her mother who's got dementia, she's trying to hold down a job at the same time. That's a typical example of what's going on right the way across the country. And it's interesting, it is falling onto women largely because of the nature of our culture. And we just need an emergency injection of cash at the moment. Otherwise, we're seeing people suffering, people being treated on trolleys, people waiting long hours, operations being cancelled, and people in a desperate plight. So we're asking the government now, it's got to apply a scale of resources to NHS and social care. We'll be coming forward with our own proposals in a matter of weeks in detail, and we'll be inviting the government also to look at a bipartisan approach for the future, because we need stable funding of the NHS. But wherever the resources are drawn from, what we're saying is we need a hypothecated level of resources going to the NHS, independently supervised. We can't keep on going through this crisis-to-crisis situation in the NHS and social care. There needs to be hypothecated funding going into that. The independent role of the OBR-type body, I think, is important for us. John Ashworth mentioned that a couple of weeks ago. That's why I wrote to Robert Choate. I think the OBR most probably could do it with an extended remit, and will we be inviting government to change legislation to enable that to happen, to restore confidence in the overall funding. Can I also say one thing as well, that this issue about tax evasion and tax avoidance, the problem that we've got is the government is failing to collect the taxes that we need. That's on the one hand. And then when it does collect taxes, it gives it away to the rich and the corporations, 70 billion. And under Philip Hammond's plan for us developing as a tax haven, if a Brexit deal isn't secured, that would go up to the estimates of 120 billion. So you can't have a situation where public services are supposed to be properly funded, when the taxes are not being collected because they're not hard enough and not doing the work with regard to evasion and avoidance. And yet at the same time, when they do collect money, they're giving it away to, well, as I say, the rich in capital gains tax, inheritance tax, and the corporations. And the argument was that the corporations will then invest in our economy. Well, all the latest figures are saying that the corporations are sitting on an earned income of between 500 and 700 billion and not investing. So what we're saying is it needs a fair taxation system, and we'll be coming forward with proposals on that in due course. With regard to Owen, I gave him his first job after university, if you remember. And basically what he said is that there's a range of things that we should be doing, and he put a number of options up. And one of the options was get out there, develop a real narrative, develop radical policies that excite people, and let's get out on the stomp to convince them. That's exactly what we're doing today. That's exactly what we're doing today. So thank you, Owen, for your advice. We're following part of it. I've invited Owen in on a regular basis to come along and advise us, but obviously he wants to maintain his independence as a journalist, and I respect that. But in the spirit that we now have of unity, we will listen to everybody. We will listen to everybody, because we've got to unite. We've got to unite. And in that way, I think we'll surprise people in the coming months about how effectively we can campaign. Michael.
You and Peter Mandelson are old colleagues, if I remember rightly, from the TUC days. Why don't you invite him to advise you? Because I'm sure if he did, he would say that what you've just said in your speech is just hopelessly unrealistic. It's what happened. It would remind him of 45, 64, 74, even elements of the Blair-Brown government. Tax, 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 spend, 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 financial crisis, slam the brakes on, and it's a Labour government every time that ends up cutting public expenditure. That's what Peter Mandelson would surely say. No, he'd most probably say that Michael Crick never listens. There's no reference to any tax increase in this, apart from making sure they pay their taxes.
We're asking them to pay their taxes. We're asking them to publish their tax forms. I publish mine. I invite Philip Hammond to publish his as well, because we have a special responsibility to either, as he is, minding the exchequer, and I hopefully will do in the future. I just want openness and transparency. In that way, we would be able to, I think, more effectively tackle tax evasion, tax avoidance, don't you? With openness and transparency, it becomes the basis. I actually also, you know, I think paying your taxes is a civic duty, and people should be proud of that. I pay this level of taxes, and what it does, it provides the care and support for the elderly, the NHS, the education of our children, etc. I want to create a culture where people are proud of the taxes that they invest in our economy. With regard to Peter, yeah, in our youth we both worked for the TUC. We maybe learnt different lessons from that, but I went along to listen to his speech in the House of Lords the other night, and I thought it was an incredibly interesting speech. And after that, I took the view that actually I would meet him and talk it through, because we need everyone's advice on how we go forward, particularly on the Brexit negotiations. What he said was exactly the same as us. We need access to that single market. If we lose access to that single market, we're already seeing that the threat of not getting access to that single market is influencing investment decisions. That's our worry, and I share his worry. So yes, I will be inviting him to come and have a cup of tea and discuss issues around of common concern, etc. I don't think he'll be as critical of this speech, well, I might be wrong, but I don't think he'll be as critical of this speech as you suggest, because there's elements in here which I think he will want to support, particularly about long-term patient investment, not just in our public services, but in our industries, and particularly with regard to the development of a regional balance of our investment in government. Anyway, I'll look forward to that cup of tea. Anyone else wants to come in? I'm trying to get members of the public in. I don't know whether you're a journalist or not.
Business?
Oh, go on.
Brett of Builders Merchants Federation. My question is about air pollution and dirty diesel. Yeah. The newspaper's quite gleefully reminding us that it's all Gordon Brown and Barry Gardner's problem of recalibrating taxes. But you spoke about hypothecation. I'm interested to see what market you're in for the ideas here, because today in London, Sadiq Khan, in Leeds, Judith Blake, in Birmingham, John Clancy, Simon Letts in Southampton, all cities that your party controls, we have got a problem in that merchants, in my case, builders merchants, have got to use HGV vans. Are you in the market for hypothecating vehicle tax to help businesses change their fleet for cleaner, greener vehicles?
I don't want to make policy on the hoop, but we're open to discussion at all stages. Here's praise for Peter Mandelson. One of the best things that Peter Mandelson did in government was the scrappage scheme, because it turned around our industry in terms of car manufacture. And there's lots of ideas floating around scrappage schemes, as well as support in terms of transfer to a reduction in our carbon economy. So we're open to those proposals. Happy to meet you any time. Okay. Any other comments or questions? Yeah. Oh, hi there, Beulah. I didn't see you there. Yeah, go on.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Between 2007 and 2015, the UK was the only big advanced economy in which wages contracted while the economy expanded. How do we protect the low-paid worker?
Okay. Beulah's a local councillor. She's one of the heroes and heroines that we have in local government, desperately trying to maintain public services in the most difficult situation. Thanks for what you do, Beulah. Thanks for what you do. The issue for us is, at the moment, low pay is the scourge. We have, as you know, 2/3 of our children now who live in poverty are in families where someone's at work. So why is that? It's because pay is so low. That's why we're committed to the £10 an hour. But to protect wages, you also need to ensure people have got rights at work. That's why the Trade Union Act is, I think, a malevolent influence on the ability of people to protect their wages and negotiate decent working conditions. That's why we'll scrap that. It does mean ensuring that you have an effective trade union movement to protect workers, negotiate on a sectoral basis, as we did. 20 or 30 years ago, well, 20 years ago, I think it was something like 2/3 of us were in work where our earnings were determined by sectoral pay bargaining. We want to restore sectoral pay bargaining, so that enables people to negotiate proper, decent wages and working conditions. But we need a real living wage. And there's no use, when George Osborne branded an increase in the minimum wage as a living wage, well, he was having a laugh, wasn't he, really? Because it wasn't a living wage. What we want is a real living wage. That's why we think £10 an hour will do that. When you go out on the street and talk about that, it's incredibly popular. But also you just discover what low wages are. And sometimes you're meeting people in our constituency, you meet people, you just think, how are they surviving given the housing costs that they've got? And that's why we get to a situation where last year, what was it? The figure was a million, not a million people, but was 1 million times food was giving out at food banks across this country. That's scandalous. What are we, the 6th richest country in the world? And we've got 1 million times people have had to go just to get the basic food to put on the table. And it is true. We've had story after story of parents choosing between who eats in the family. Pensioners choosing, should they eat or should they turn the heating on? That's unacceptable. So that's why we need a real living wage, and that's what we'll do. Okay.
Ted Wigsell from your business community. We represent the fastest growing sector of the economy, namely self-employed and small businesses. It's been reported that 15% of the workforce is self-employed. Yeah. There's record numbers of limited companies being formed. It's evident that this is business reaction to over-regulation. You're talking about living wage. If 15% of the economy is self-employed, that's 15% of people that are removed from living wage. Yeah. That allows business to choose who they're paying, avoiding holiday pay, sick pay, maternity pay, and pay people late as well. 15% of the economy is a huge constituency, and any Labour Party that wants to be elected needs to recognise that fact.
That's why when we were talking about the living wage, I think when we had this conversation before with our range of business advisors and those we consult, we were saying when there's a business that is struggling on that, we'd use the employment support allowance as a vehicle to assist them through that period and assist them in terms of making sure that they can pay their workers. But the issue around, there's a good point around self-employed. We had this discussion before. There's this issue around bogus self-employment we've got to address. There's no doubt about that. I was on the tube a month ago. A guy gets on, sits beside me. We have a chat. R&T member. He was a track maintenance worker. Now, he used to work for tube lines. They went bust. He's now supposedly self-employed. And they all are. The only people were the supervisors were directly employed. He has to pay £50 a month to someone to do his tax and his wages and that sort of thing. And again, it'd been doing that for 7 years. That isn't self-employment as such. So we've got to tackle that. But also we've got to recognise self-employment has been growing significantly, yes, out of choice for a large number of people. And what we've got to do is develop forward our policies, and this is what Becky Long-Bailey is doing. We've had various discussions about it, about how we make sure self-employment also doesn't mean falling into poverty as well. And the way in which you can do that is make sure contracts are properly supervised. That's why you use public procurement, so there isn't that pressure on the self-employed as against the big boys, if you like, the big organisations negotiating. But also you need to look at how we look at the benefit system in the future. Because again, what we don't want is in 20 or 30 years' time, those self-employed people having a crisis in their pensions because they haven't paid for it now. So it's a huge project that's going on. We're hoping that Philip Hammond will be saying something about the self-employed next week. And again, if there's some sensible proposals coming forward, we'll want to work on a bipartisan basis on that. But if not, we'll develop our own policies over these coming weeks, and you'll see that as part of the publications. Yeah.
I got an invitation to this meeting by email, and I went back and said, will there be an induction loop working for deaf people?
Is there?
It doesn't work, but I'm not going to blame anybody because in my experience they never work, especially in Lambeth. There's one in the town hall that works, but there's a new town hall being built. I'd like to make a suggestion that in future you could employ a stenographer, because they only cost a few £100, and I'd be willing to contribute. And also to have a transcript of your speech. That would be good for me, so I can take it back to my Labour Party and tell them that some progress is being made in this area. The second thing is, about a year ago in The Guardian, I read an article by you which talked about iPad socialism. And I think it's a very interesting concept, because I've been working on some areas with computers and mathematics, and there's certainly scope for improvement in education and a way of democratizing education in the classroom, making life for school teachers easier with this concept of iPad socialism and mathematics. And I'd like you to, I've never heard anything more about that concept, and I'd like you to elaborate on it now.
Okay.
And thank you very much.
All right, here's a copy of the speech anyway. There's a copy of the speech anyway, okay. Can I just, well, there'll be representatives here from the South Bank Centre who will take on board the issues around whether the loop is working at the moment. Okay, if you could do that, that's great. We normally, in every venue we have that as a requirement. But you're right, they're hit or miss when they work. That's part of the problem, but that'll be taken back. I did a speech about investment in new technology and in scientific and also in research and development in particular, because the government had cut $1 billion out of research and development. And I was trying to argue that actually we've got to go into the global economy where the jobs with the high wages are, and the high wages are going to be where the high skills are, and that's going to be around new technology. So we needed to develop investment streams around new technology. And it's interesting, a number of our local authorities are looking at how they can facilitate that sort of growth by establishing business hubs, particularly with new technology in mind. And then it's about developing aids and apps, if you like, that can be used in public services throughout. And in my own area, we're trying to work between the hospital and the local Brunel University in every department to look at how new technology can be used to improve the public services there. Their problem is they want to do it, but it requires investment, and the investment isn't there from government. That's why we said we'll set up a national investment bank. It will have regional arms. The mandate for those regional arms will be determined locally. And so you'll develop your local industrial strategy on the basis of what you think, based upon the development of skills in that area, you could develop within your local area to develop the products and then the markets. Now, that buzz is going on around the country now. We're doing regional economic conferences all around the country. We did Liverpool, it was packed out, it was incredible. I think we're in Glasgow next week and then Newcastle after that, and back down to Birmingham, Bristol, etc. And then we'll come back to London. But the idea is to actually encourage people to get involved in that development of that potential. I called it socialism with an iPad. I wish I hadn't now, because it may not have been the right phrase, it was a bit glib, but actually what it tried to do is say new technology is where we want to go in terms of the development of a lot of our economy. And actually, if we can produce that prosperity from the development of new technology and share that prosperity, actually that's a form of socialism we want to implement. Okay, final thing. I'm going on at length, I'm sorry. Final thing, within the Labour Party now, I was at Goldsmiths last week about platform co-ops, and we're working with a guy called Richard Barbrook from Westminster University and a whole team where we're trying to introduce much more digital democracy into our procedures in the Labour Party so that people can have access. And a group of young people have developed a range of apps that we can use to do that. So in the discussions in our build-up to our National Economic Conference in May in Birmingham, we're going to try and use digital democracy for people to feed in their ideas, like you have just done, into that debate and discussion, and then have them linked with others who are interested in that particular idea, that they can then form groups to develop it into a concrete proposal from implementation in government, either the local, regional or national level. I think that's really exciting. It's a sort of the concept of us being a social movement again means we need to use new tools that social movement needs to develop those ideas and engage with people. Meetings like this and others are really interesting. It's good to do face-to-face meetings, but now we've got the potential of new technology for new forms of democracy. We're going to drive that through. We'll be at the leading edge of all of that. Final question, and then they're going to throw us out, I think. That's the problem.
I would like to know what is the Labour policy about the banks where we are the shareholders, and they're still losing millions of pounds, and their directors and the chief executives are getting big bonuses. What is our policies? And secondly, what are our plans to encourage small and medium-sized and especially BME businesses,
Yep.
to encourage them?
On the latter point, what we're trying to use is the National Investment Bank and its regional arms to support small businesses, SMEs in particular, to ensure the mandate of those regional banks are focused on the combination of small and medium enterprises and at the same time the development of the cooperative sector, and we're looking at alternative forms of ownership. With regard to the banks themselves, again, there's a review that we're taking place at the moment on governance overall within the corporate sector. How do we make them more accountable? How do we make them more representative? How do we make them more democratic? And in that way also, how do we make them working alongside government rather than independently, so that we're working on the same agenda, for example, like the investment in an overall industrial strategy. That discussions will go on. You'll see a number of reports coming out at the same time. We've got a group of various people that we've brought together doing various reviews. We've just published Bob Kerslake's review, Lord Kerslake's review of the Treasury. That was published a fortnight ago. There'll be a report out shortly on the National Investment Bank. There will also be further reports in March and into April about corporate governance structures, and look forward to those. And again, we'll try to use our digital mechanisms as much as possible to get them out. The speech today will be placed on the internet, the website, for everyone to see as well, and we'll distribute it widely. We've got to go now, haven't we? Okay, thanks a lot for coming along. I'm really grateful. Thank you.